in the early years, uh, if you knew what my farm looks like, right down in that spot there in the center of the screen where I'm circling the cursor is where the house is. Obviously, that you don't see a house. So the very first season was all about layout, get trees in the ground, start to work on the house, but it's not finished. It still isn't finished to this day, 26 years later. um, what we've done for these successional strategies are utilize the agroforestry techniques, primarily alley cropping and silvopasture. Those are the big two that we use most. And alley cropping, a simple way to explain alley cropping is you have an alley where your crop is grown, your cash crop, and this is asparagus, and then a row where your trees go, then an alley, and then a row, and in this case is a road, a farm road, and so on. So the pattern repeats itself over the whole property. A row of trees, alley of crop, row of trees, alley of crop. What this one also shows, this dark line here and here, every year for probably the first 15 or 20 years, next to the row of trees, between the trees and my cash crop, I drag a subsoiler in order to root prune the trees so the roots wouldn't go out and steal nutrient from the crop, nutrient and moisture from the crop. That's worked really well. It also helps for water to penetrate. And since everything is pitched towards the ridge, if rain strikes this field, and if you get 3 inches of rain in an hour on red clay soil, it's not going to penetrate, so it moves, and then it'll hit the slot and it'll go out towards the ridge. And if it does happen to overload the slot, it goes to the next one. It still creeps towards the ridge. If it overflows that, it hits the next one, and eventually goes down and hits the swale, gets carried out to the ridge, and it sheets across the ridge. My goal is to have no water leave the property on the surface as flash flood overflow. I want it to soak in and emerge as springs. And the blue arrow is right where that little pocket pond is, that same one right there, the same as there. Boom, boom. So a few years later, things grow, obviously. There actually are chestnut trees planted in this row down here. A few years later, you can now start to see some trees. And you can see that my cash flow is dependent on things like this. I believe this year that was cucumbers. Okay, this was cucumbers. The reason why I know it's cucumbers is because I'd keep a fallow field next to it, and the cucumbers that weren't market quality, I'd throw it into the fallow field and disc them in. And so you can see the asparagus starting to, the first planting of asparagus starting to really kick in. And if you got good eyes, you see that line right there in the asparagus patch. This is where I ran out of Idaho rock phosphate to put in the bottom of the trench when planting the asparagus the very first year. You can still see the difference in the asparagus in that field 25 years later, just because that first stuff had a shot of Idaphos at the beginning to get going. So this also reveals some of my cover cropping pattern, which we won't have time to get into. But the foreground, this is in an active fallow for plow down, a lot of yellow sweet clover. It was previously some kind of small grain that was there that I rolled down or disked in, and the clover came up underneath it. A few more years go by, and now you start to see the trees are really kicking in. There's the pocket pond is over there. And here's the asparagus patches that you can have a hard time seeing. You see that all of a sudden, at this point in time, we're able to afford a wind turbine. And you can see hazelnut bushes here. There are chestnut trees. This is the part of the farm that has mostly chestnut and hazelnut apples on the far right-hand side. So these are just all pictures of succession that change through time. And some of our grains in the alley crop. And that's the same place. Look at this. Just the same as this over here. And just a few years later, poof. So to say that you can't farm this way, it's not true. It actually works. I've done it. It still works. People say, well, how can you harvest everything? It's impossible to harvest. I say, excuse me, Dakota, I know you're illiterate, but that's a plum. It's ripe. Go pick the plums. This is a grape. They're not ripe. Don't pick the grapes. And even you can figure that out. Or it's like, hey, these are grapes. Those are apples. They're both ripe right now, but today we're picking apples. Please pick the apples. You eat the grapes. And
I think I'm getting the hang of this.
So I don't have trellises for any of my grapevines. I trellis them right on the trees, even out in my fruit. Why should I prune a vineyard and then go prune an orchard when I can prune a vineyard? And then what I learned after a while is like, I really don't even have to prune the vineyard very much at all. Just kind of let it go crazy. And as long as I can get by with a tractor and the animals can graze underneath, I'm happy as can be. When the grapes get too high up above my head, I'll go out in the fall and I'll pull the vines down. Last year, I pulled probably 100 vines. And then, of course, it causes damage and this and that, the other thing. But so what? It's super fast. Yank, and you got like bushels and bushels of grapes all over the place. And the apples, I'll go by and I'll pick what's called the low-hanging fruit. What a concept. Who's he pointing at? So I'll pick the low-hanging fruit. Then once I've finished harvesting, I'll turn the pigs loose and let them have the rest as the apples and pears and cherries and plums fall off the trees.